Hello, I'm Raymond Moody. The most important question that has perplexed humankind throughout our history is there life after death? I have spent my entire career investigating the question of an afterlife, and I've interviewed thousands of people with near-death experiences, lectured all over the world, and published several books on the subject. Obviously, there is no conclusive answer to life after death. But my recent conversation with Eben Alexander has taken this important discussion to a whole new level. Dr. Alexander, for 15 years, was professor of neurosurgery at Harvard University and an internationally renowned neuroscientist. In 2008, he suffered from E. coli meningitis, which I can tell you as a physician is virtually unsurvivable. During the time he was in a coma, which lasted a week, he was carefully monitored by medical equipment, which showed he had no brain activity. Yet, as you're about to hear, he came out of that coma to talk about an incredible voyage to another world. In his best-selling book, Proof of Heaven, he offers compelling arguments that his experience cannot be explained by even the latest neurophysiological findings. Dr. Alexander's experience is the most fascinating and amazing story that I've heard in almost 50 years of investigating this phenomenon. Our conversation took place at his home in Virginia, and I began by asking him to tell us about his background.
I grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. My father was a neurosurgeon, academic neurosurgeon at Wake Forest, and so my upbringing was very much in what I would call a scientific home. I mean, he knew a lot about science, and I remember reading Scientific American every month that it came in, you know, when I was a kid, and just totally into science and kind of the scientific worldview. Initially, I was fascinated with astronomy and physics. In fact, that's what I started out in college majoring in, but then I ended up going towards medicine, and in many ways, I think wanting to follow in his footsteps, although for many years, I said, yes, I'll follow in his footsteps, but not too closely. I figured his shoes were way too big to fill, and therefore I was not necessarily aiming for neurosurgery. And then, of course, when I did my neurosurgery training, I said, oh my gosh, he was right. And so that's why I ended up going into that and have loved it ever since. I grew up in a fairly religious home in a sense. We went to a Methodist church, and Dad had been a combat surgeon in the Pacific in World War II, and I think his strong spiritual nature is what got him through all that. So I had that kind of an upbringing and said prayers and things like that, but I had a pretty strong kind of dialogue, at least in myself, about science and spirituality, and science seemed to usually have a bit of an upper hand. And then I ended up in neurosurgery, spent 15 years at Harvard Medical School after my training mainly at Duke. And I would say during those years, it was less and less clear to me that I could really see how there could be a spiritual realm. I became very seduced by the physicalist view of the world, that if we can explain it in terms of quarks and protons, neutrons and photons, then it's real, otherwise it's not real. And thought I understood consciousness. Having been in academic neurosurgery, for more than 15 years, I thought I knew how the brain created consciousness, mind, soul, spirit, and then I found out that I was absolutely wrong.
So what was it that happened?
Well, it happened in this very house back on November the 10th of 2008. And at the time I was working up in Charlottesville at the Focused Ultrasound Surgery Foundation. And I remember waking up early that morning. It was a Monday morning, and I woke up about 4:30 and had severe back pain. As soon as I got out of bed, I realized I had very bad back pain, and I barely made it to the bathroom, was able to get into a warm tub thinking that would help, and it didn't help at all. And then I barely was able to get myself out of the tub and back to the bedroom, and Holly was rubbing my back and trying to make me feel better. And then about 7 o'clock, our son Bond, our younger son, who at that time was 10 years old, Bond came in the room, and what's going on? Why is Dad still here? And he saw I was very uncomfortable. He came over and started rubbing my temples. And when he did, I felt like he had driven a white-hot railroad spike right through the front of my head. And just severe pain, and I didn't know what was going on at the time. And Holly wanted to call 911, but I said, no, don't do that. Trust me, I'm a doctor. It's muscle spasm. Don't call an ambulance. And then finally I started to lose consciousness, and she thought I was resting. So Holly had left me to rest, thinking I was going to sleep, and little did she know I was slipping into coma. She did call my partners to find out what to do next, and then when she came up to check on me a few hours later, she saw me having a grand mal seizure on the bed, and she did call 911 at that point, and they came and hustled me off to the ER and were finally able to break my seizures. But I don't remember any of that at all. I don't remember anything for the next week. I was gone from this world.
And during that time where, I've seen your medical records, so in a very real way, you were dead.
Yeah, it actually took me a few months after I came back to appreciate just how ill I was, and also how perfect a model for human death meningitis is. I had a very severe case of spontaneous E. coli meningitis. E. coli causes meningitis in newborns. Very rare to cause meningitis in a patient over 3 months of age. So this was quite unusual, and basically at the most about a 1 in 10 million incidence of E. coli meningitis spontaneously in adults. So it was terrifically rare. And my doctors were kind of struggling with that, because by my second day, after I got in the hospital, in the emergency room, they did a lumbar puncture, found that my CSF was basically all pus. In fact, the cerebrospinal fluid glucose level, which normally is 60 to 80, and in a bad case of bacterial meningitis might go down to 20. In my case, it went all the way down to 1. So I was extremely ill from this. My neurologic exams showed that my cortical function was very compromised, and then got worse as the week went on. I was on a ventilator the whole week. I don't remember anything of it at all, but I was extremely sick, which I only found out much later, and was not responding to 3 very powerful antibiotics, and that was the part that was most vexing for my physicians, because normally if you're in a coma from meningitis, just presenting to the emergency room with bacterial meningitis, having descended into coma over a few hours, already that gave me about a 90% chance of dying from this illness on that hospitalization. And then, of course, each day I did not respond to antibiotics, that 90% mortality crept up towards 100%. And the doctors, by the end of the week, were predicting that at best, even if I did survive this, that I would probably spend 3 months in intensive rehabilitation, and then the rest of my life in a nursing home. So I consider myself very fortunate to have survived all this, and my doctors would basically tell you that it was a miracle that it was one thing, probably about a 2% chance of living by the end of that week, and I did live, but the chances of having full recovery of my function, they would say there's no way. That cannot happen. Yes. They would say this is very miraculous that I've had a full recovery, and had it fairly quickly. I would say over about 3 months. Everything came back.
I too am just amazed. I just don't know of anything that could explain what you went through. But while everybody was waiting for the final event, I understand you had a conscious experience during this time.
That is the part that to me was the most shocking, because if you had asked me before my coma, as an academic neurosurgeon, how much would somebody remember after being in deep coma from severe bacterial meningitis, spending a week in coma, I would say they wouldn't remember anything, not a thing. In fact, I would promise you that in the days where they appeared to be waking up, that their memory was still not working, and they wouldn't remember any of that either. Interesting point to understand about my experience is that when I was deep in coma, I remembered a tremendous amount, but it all formed, all those memories occurred, the experience occurred, when I had no memories whatsoever of my life on Earth. I had no recollection at all of humans, Earth, this universe. I had no words. All of my words were completely gone. There was no language. So my first memories from deep inside coma were of a very murky, muddy kind of underground, or as if I were under dirty jello. I did not have any body awareness at all, and I could kind of sense around me and had a very strong memory of roots, of kind of these dark red or black roots that were kind of going by around me. And no body awareness, and just kind of this eternal now, kind of a pounding, monotonous sound, deep off in the muck around me somewhere. And I don't think I had any kind of active memory formation. It all seemed to be very foamy to me. And at times I've said that it was kind of like trying to look through a window on a very dark and stormy night with torrents of rain pouring down the window pane, and trying to glimpse at what is on the other side of that window when it's just black and rain. And it really, it sounds very foreboding to talk about it now, but I had no memory whatsoever of my prior existence. So I don't remember it being particularly bothersome when I was living through it.
Because you had no contrast.
Right, I had nothing to compare it with. There were, I remember there would be kind of faces that would boil up out of the muck. They were grotesque, kind of animal. They could even be plant for all I know, just that they'd boil up out of this muck, and kind of there'd be a roar, some chant or screech, and then they go back into the muck. And it seemed to go on for a very, very long time. And as I said, a very pounding, mechanical, monotonous sound deep in the background, but it was very unchanging. And even if I had a concern, a curiosity, like, what is this? Even though I didn't have words, but just, you know, what is all this? There was never a response, never anything at all. Just a monotonous, pounding, eternal, foamy, completely incomprehensible muck all around me. And without having any prior memories, I also had no concept of time. And that's why this seemed to go on and on and on. If I had to put a number on it, months, years, a very, very long time. Just, and then in the midst of that, and for reasons that are still beyond me, but when I was at kind of the depths of that murky existence, there came this spinning bright light. Filaments kind of coming off, very fine and beautiful, extremely rich, slowly rotating. And it came towards me, and it came with this beautiful melody, with this absolutely, I mean, the contrast between this and everything I'd known in that existence was so extreme. This beautiful spinning light, little sparkles of gold off on the filaments, and this melody, indescribable, beautiful melody that was so kind of entrancing, hypnotizing. And as it came closer to me, I saw it was kind of a rip in my world, and it opened up into this beautiful, what at the bottom was this dark valley that went up into this lovely light, and it was absolutely rich with this greenery growth, and I realized, again, I had no body awareness at this time, but I was on the wing of a butterfly, and it was absolutely gorgeous, and up very slowly, kind of looping as we ascended up into this valley, and we would fly by flowers and by tree buds, and these flowers and the buds would open as we flew past, and there were millions of other butterflies, all in these slow looping formations. Lovely scene, waterfalls into crystal blue pools, and this mist kind of coming off of the water. As I said, the greenery was the richest, lushest vegetation ever, and there was, beside me on this butterfly wing, was a beautiful girl. And she was stunningly lovely with high cheekbones and sparkling blue eyes, and this very light brown hair that was framing her face. Her face was so lovely. And she looked at me with this look of just pure love and adoration, and it was the most comforting thing that I can imagine. Certainly the most comforting thing that had ever happened to me, ever. This beautiful girl sitting there, and she never said a word, and she was smiling. And she would look at me, and her thoughts would come straight into my awareness. And her thoughts, when I was writing all this up in the weeks after I came out of coma, even though the concepts were pure, they didn't need any words at all, but the translating it into words as I was trying to write all this down. You are loved, cherished dearly forever. There's nothing you can do wrong. You will be eternally loved, and you have nothing to fear. And it was so comforting, and especially after that kind of murky, pounding, monotonous, unresponsive underground, which I later came to call the earthworm eye view, that initial part. This was absolutely beautiful, with this beautiful girl. And I remember seeing below us, below this butterflies, were flying along and looping with these rivers of life of these beautiful butterflies in constant motion up and down into the greenery. There were what I originally called in my writings peasants or villagers who were down below us, and they were dancing. Lots of joy and merriment, children playing games together. Remember dogs jumping, and just this lovely, lovely world that was below us. And in looking back on it, I think that those were souls. Those were human souls. And there was a breeze that blew through this scene that was the most magical. It was like the ultimate perfect summer breeze that just blew right through this scene. And although the entire scene stayed the same, my knowing of it, that this was divine, that there was this incredible divine loving being that created all of this and was part of all of it. When that breeze came through, that was my awareness of that divine, infinitely loving, unconditionally loving deity that was there behind all of this. And from that moment, we went outside of this universe. And I remember just seeing the entire, every bit of that collapse down, galaxies and everything collapsing down into this very complex corrugated ball that was higher dimensional space. It was an oversphere, hypersphere. It was much more complex and intricate. And as that collapsed down, I realized that we were out in a void that even the word infinity does not begin to do it justice. And I could feel all the way out to the boundaries that did not exist and beyond. And again, no body awareness. I was just aware of existing. And there was this brilliant orb of light, brighter than 1,000 bright stars, right there, acting as kind of a counterpoint to that darkness, the infinite darkness in this void, that actually was very comforting. and loving. It felt very much like home. And it was there that I was really aware of there being this brilliant orb of light and the creative oneness that I'd felt, that divine connection that I'd felt in the breeze just before we left, and then my awareness. But this was far beyond being an individual person's awareness. I mean, this was awareness of a consciousness of all of eternity and all throughout higher dimensional universes, and very much the link of consciousness with that divine creator. And the concept, again, this is long before words came back to me, but the conceptual flow was perfect. And the concept was, and it was delivered by this divine being in the orb of light, is, we will teach you many things. You're not here to stay. And from that point on, the teaching just flowed about all the nature of existence, about our reason for being, about love, and how love was the tremendous, overwhelming constituent of all that existed. How evil was there as a necessity, because traces of the evil, that impurity, was there because of our need to manifest free will and do it in such a way that we manifested that unconditional love of the Creator. And all the lessons about the physical makeup of time, space, mass, energy, the higher dimensional spaces, some of it extremely complex that I cannot put into human words at all because it's so far beyond our human conceptualization. And the lessons would flow in these incredible, complete works of knowing. And lots about the physical makeup. I remember dark energy, dark matter being very kind of primitive levels of the geometry of this structure, but then many higher levels of knowing and seeing, of things that humans won't even be aware of as conceptual entities for eons to come. And then is an odd word because then implies that time flow works like it does here, but I would be back in the murky underground realm, the earthworm eye view. And there was no transition, there was no pause, no kind of, oh, well then I went down here. But that I discovered much later on as I was putting all this together and trying to remember this and write it down, was a big part of the overall lesson. And I then spent a long time back in this murky underground, and then the murky underground was not as comfortable because I now knew there was something much richer. But what finally happened was I realized that by remembering the notes, that beautiful melody, and I could remember the notes, and then that fine filamentous light would start spinning in front of me again. And it would come closer and closer, and the notes got louder and the music richer, and then I could see that it was opening up and it was back out into that beautiful gateway on the butterfly wing, and back with my beautiful companion, that lovely girl, and she was there. And that happened several times where I would go up through the gateway into the core, that infinite realm where they would teach me, and I was always reminded, you will be going back.
Yeah.
You're not here to stay. And at that time, my thinking was, I guess back is back to the earthworm eye view. And of course, I got to a point where I thought that's okay, because I knew I could spin this melody, remember the notes, spin up the melody, and that would take me back. But they always reminded me, you're not here to stay. And then there finally came a point when the melody didn't work. And then I was, I remember tremendous, indescribable sadness, knowing that I could no longer get in there using the melody. Tremendous sadness, and yet by that point, having been in there and been taught these lessons, I knew I would be taken care of. I knew that they would help me in whatever path I was to follow, even though it wasn't going back where I wanted to, back to that heavenly, beautiful realm of pure love. And it was at that point that I was aware of just coming down through these tremendous billowy, steamy clouds, and just kind of, where is this going? And then seeing arcs of people going off into the distance, and all these people were kneeling, and many of them had hoods on, some with candles, and they were kneeling, and these arcs just went off as far as you could see into the darkness, and there was all this murmuring coming up from them. And as I wrote all this down weeks later, it was clear to me, although this was not a word I had or a concept that was clear at the time, but that they were praying. And that those prayers were generating these beautiful clouds of energy that were billowing, and that were actually then bringing me up. And they were very comforting. And I think in retrospect, the lesson about that was they were welcoming me back to this realm. And of course, the earthly realm was something I had not yet seen in my existence, because all my memory of it had been erased. And but I was being welcomed back by these prayers, and the prayers were so beautiful and welcoming. And it was from that time that I was then in a realm that looked a lot like that murky earthworm eye view, but I was very comforted because I knew I could trust and have faith that I would be taken care of. And that is when I started to see faces that were like human faces. And in the next few hours, I would actually be waking up in the ICU, because this was the 7th day of my coma. And I didn't know who these faces were when I saw them. I didn't recognize them. I still didn't have any language. They would say words. It was a lot like those old Charlie Brown Christmas cartoons where the adults speak wah, 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 wah. Because I could hear sounds but had no clue what they were saying. But my visual memory was starting to work very well. Just like I remembered my beautiful companion on the butterfly wing perfectly. And her face was stuck in my mind. I'll never forget it. And likewise, these faces would come and they'd say these words, and then they'd go away back into the muck. But I remembered visually exactly what they looked like. And 5 of them were people who were there in the ICU with me that last 6th night and then the 7th morning. One of them was a person who was not physically there, who was a very good friend of my wife's, of Holly's, a friend named Susan Wrenches. And Susan lives in Chapel Hill. She had done some work in healing coma patients by channeling to them, which is something I certainly didn't understand from before, from my neurosurgical life. But in the spirit realm, she would go to them. And I remember her as clearly as I do the other 5 faces who were there. And Susan would come to me. I couldn't understand her words either, but I remembered her being there, although physically she was never there. So there was then one other face, though, that really got my attention. And that was my 10-year-old son, Bond. And I did not recognize him. I had no concept of a son, but there was something about it. And it turns out that in the ICU that Sunday morning, he had come in and had overheard some news from the doctors that maybe they would be talking about withdrawing antibiotics or something, but he had gotten the idea that things were not going at all well. And so he had run into the room, into my ICU room. I was still on the ventilator, still in coma with my eyes, this way and that way. And he had pulled open my eyes and was going, "Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay." And he was rubbing me and kissing me, and "Daddy, you're going to be okay." And there was something about that got through. And so I remember it as being probably the most terrifying moment of the entire journey. And I was terrified because I realized up until that point, my thinking had been the outcome doesn't matter. And given that I didn't understand how that world worked, that was very comforting. I could continue to exist, not exist, who cares? And that was my defense. That's the only defense. So now all of a sudden, I got the impression I was not the only one. There was another one out there. And I had to figure out how this all worked. I had to figure out the rules. I had to try and survive. And that was terrifying, because so far the only real power I'd had over anything was the fact that I could remember that melody and spin up the beautiful light, and that would take me back into that wonderful realm. So it really was terrifying, but that was right at the time that I was starting to actually wake up in the ICU. And the doctors had said that I really was not going to do well, didn't have much chance of surviving this. And so when all of a sudden my eyes are focusing and looking around and I'm struggling and trying to reach up for the tube, that was a gigantic change. Nobody could understand where in the world that came from, because my brain had been so wiped out by the meningitis that nobody expected that kind of recovery, especially right then and there. And so Dr. Wade took out the tube, the endotracheal tube, and I said, "Thank you." And that was such a giant shock to everybody. I mean, to even have me coming back at all, but to actually say some words.
Really?
And my language did start coming back very rapidly. Although the next 24 hours were kind of up and down through a kind of a wild psychotic nightmare, an ICU psychosis, which I had seen before many times as a neurosurgeon. And that was very, very different from what had happened deep in coma. Deep in coma was this crisp, sharp, perfect reality, much more real than this world, and with thoughts and lessons coming in with great power and completeness that are beyond the capacity of what I think my brain, even now fully recovered, could manage, much less a brain that was thought, on the verge of death, compromised by severe bacterial meningitis. And so, in fact, this ICU psychosis, this crazy nightmare, which had a lot of language in it, it was very much kind of a crazy nightmare, a little more real than a normal nightmare, but nothing like the ultra reality deep in coma.
Well, now that's very interesting, because, if you were planning out a near-death experience to give to someone else so that they could know about this for sure, you'd want to put a little psychotic episode in there so that they could tell the difference.
Well, initially, as I recovered over the next few days, I was still kind of fragile, but language was coming back, my brain was coming back, and I would mention occasionally, I had this brilliant memory of what had happened deep in coma that was just stunning and ultra real. And I would mention little facets of that to people. And I clearly got the impression, oh, you were very sick. You almost died. When your brain is soaking in pus and you're on these powerful medications, deep in coma, anything can happen. And so initially, the message to me was, don't make a big deal of this. You're really sick, and that's the way the sick brain behaves. And so that's pretty much, I assumed that. It was shocked. I was shocked by the ultra reality of it. That's a stunning quality, and the power of these thoughts and these concepts, and the back and forth between this incredibly rich and beautiful gateway and the core, and being there with the divine, with who many people would say is God in every sense of the word, the ultimate creator, omniscient, omnipotent, completely, absolutely far beyond any description in human terms, and yet infinitely loving, and so personally part of me. I mean, understanding that personal connection is such a crucial piece of knowing this, because people don't have to have a near-death experience to know this deep down in their own consciousness. They can feel that same very powerful connection. And yet, I was repeatedly kind of shown as I was coming out, and I would mention these things, oh, you were very sick. And so initially, I threw it all in one lump. I just figured, well, the ultra reality in the core, the gateway, you know, the earthworm eye view, which is the murky place, and then the beautiful outside of this universe with God and the orb of light, and this crazy nightmare where I was basically a cancer patient in South Florida, pursued by my wife and 2 Florida police officers, pushed off a 60-story building, rescued by 2 ninja photographers. I mean, it was a crazy nightmare. I put all that in one lump and said, okay, sick brain, anything can happen. That ultra reality is absolutely stunning, but there must be some explanation. And so my mission was to explain this from a neuroscientific standpoint. And somehow come up with a way to explain how an extremely rich, vibrant, interactive experience filled with these incredible lessons about the structural reality and existence, that somehow I can explain neuroscientifically how the sick brain does that. My older son, Eben IV, was wise enough. He came home 2 days after I got out of the hospital. I still had a PICC line in getting antibiotics intravenously, and I'd lost 19 pounds, so I looked a little fragile. But he talked with me, and he said he felt like there was a light shining inside me, like something very amazing had happened. The last time he'd seen me, I'd been in coma, and then he had gone back to school for a few days and had a Skype talk with me where he said I looked like a zombie. And so now here I was coming back, and I told him I want to write this up as a neuroscientific report of, you know, the amazing things that happened in coma. And he said, well, 2 pieces of advice. He was majoring in neuroscience at the time, and said, don't talk to anybody who was around. He could tell that I was trying to talk with people and compare notes. Yes. Did I ever do this, say this, act like that? He said, don't do that. Write down everything you can remember, and then start talking to people. And don't read anything. And that was, I was just dying to read everything I could get my hands on about near-death experiences, physics, cosmology. He said, don't do that. Write down everything you can remember about your story, and then you can do the reading. Best advice I ever got. And I did that. It took me 6 weeks, and I'd probably written 20,000 words when I was done. All about that core experience deep in coma. And then I started reading the near-death literature. And of course, one of the first books was your wonderful 1974, I guess it was, book that you put out, Life After Life, that was incredibly illuminating about all this. And then I read more and more accounts, and I realized how many people, probably thousands of accounts and tens of millions of people have been through exactly this, have gone to the same realm. The interesting thing to me is the more I read and the more I studied this, the more I realized that these journeys have been the same for thousands of years. Yeah. The afterlife is constant and doesn't change. It doesn't change with cultures. There's a bit of a cultural overlay that I think we bring back.
Yes.
And that I brought back a little touch of it, and other people do too. But when you get down to it, the common features and the realms described, it was very clear to me, even going back 2,000 years or more, that the accounts are about the very same place. And that was stunning. And also to realize that my experience, which I was trying to say would happen in somebody with a very intense bacterial meningitis in this special set of circumstances, actually can happen in all manner of different medical conditions. And not only that, but can happen in situations, as you reported in Glimpses of Eternity, which I thought was a fantastic book, in people who have no brain problem or health problem at all, no medical problem.
You're just standing by the bed of somebody who does die.
Exactly. And that is a very powerful reality for people to understand, that these things are very real. And the reality of that realm is undeniable. And from that time, I also then started getting much more interested in the nature of consciousness, because I knew that what my journey was telling me was that my previous ideas, after more than 15 years in academic neurosurgery, about brain creating consciousness, mind, soul, spirit, was was completely wrong. And in fact, I then became a student of the hard problem of consciousness, which is how it was defined by David Chalmers in 1996 in The Conscious Mind. But of course, the thinking about that problem had been going around for decades in neuroscience, philosophy of mind, where people realized that we have absolutely no clue how to understand physics, chemistry, biology, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology of the brain, and then here's how that creates consciousness. There's not a soul on earth who has a clue what the first phrase in that chapter is.
Exactly. The mind-body problem.
Right, the mind-body problem.
And you know, it's if you think about it, it becomes so obvious that if you had a holographic projection of every chemical reaction going on in your brain, an electrical reaction, and you could project it in like an auditorium-sized place where you could see it all at once, and you could have some way of tracking every reaction in your brain, but then introspecting and feeling that unique, indefinable sense of self-awareness and consciousness. There's a huge gap.
Right.
No matter how much we know about the chemistry.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are certainly reputable scientists, philosophers out there who would say of all of the concepts that we have in human knowledge today, the one that is probably the furthest out there in terms of being distant from us in our coming up with any solution is the hard problem, the ultimate mechanism of consciousness, how we actually construct this awareness of our conscious existence and awareness. And a lot of my research in those lines, of course, took me into quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics offers a tremendous clue about the power of consciousness and what it really involves. And then also getting into what I now call the phenomena of extended consciousness, which I think in the past some people would have said psi phenomena, parapsychology, paranormal phenomena, things like remote viewing, telekinesis, precognition, telepathy, extrasensory perception. I mean, they're all manner of phenomena in human psychology, in the operating of our minds, that are now very well established and understood, and certainly, any of my scientific colleagues who have doubts about that, I steer them to Irreducible Mind, that wonderful 2007 book, I think, from Ed Kelly and Emily Kelly and Bruce Grayson and the group at UVA. It's a wonderful examination of the data, very thorough analysis. And if people look at the data, you cannot deny that there is something about consciousness, very profound and deep, that's not local.
Yes.
Not local, not stuck in space, and not stuck in time.
Yes, which is a scary thought for some people, Eben.
Well, I think it is.
You know, I mean, some people are so terrified to say, I don't know. I mean, I can tell you, it comes easily to your lips, something is puzzling, you say, I don't know. And to me, it comes very easily to my lips, too. Matter of fact, it's kind of interesting, because if you don't know something, you've got a potential to learn something new. But one of the hardest things for me to come to realize in my life is that many people, especially people such as you and me who have been, have some sort of degree behind our names, many people are terrified to say, I don't know. And maybe partly because of the training. I mean, it's like I remember the times in medical school that you're rounded on for not knowing something. Right. But so maybe some people respond more deeply to that, but there's so many things we don't know.
Well, that's a very good point, and I must say that after this experience, especially as my neurosurgery and neuroscientific knowledge came back, which took about 3 or 4 weeks, I really had to go back to square one. I mean, for me, it was crystal clear that my concepts of consciousness, brain, mind, spirit, soul were completely wrong, and that the brain does not create consciousness. And so I really had to go back to the very beginnings and doubt everything I had ever believed. I actually, you know, I think certainly in our kind of professional day-to-day lives, you're right, we're not necessarily supposed to say, I don't know, or be very proud of the fact that I don't know. But I think a lot of people, deep down, are interested in truth.
Yes.
They would like to know truth.
What is.
And I think that's one of the reasons why there certainly were times in the 20th century where, you know, to be a big fan of kind of religion and spirituality, you had to get used to the concept that people might say, oh, well, this is the scientific era, you know, and truth is handed down by scientists. And I think science is wonderful. I still am a scientist and love science. But I now have a much broader view of reality and existence. And I realized that for all those years that I thought I understood brain and mind and consciousness, just like a lot of the kind of conventional scientific world, I was ignoring that giant white elephant in the room, which is consciousness, which is an extremely deep mystery that is probably one that, in my view, I think you could argue that there are reasons why the human brain and mind as such will never completely understand the mechanism of consciousness.
Yes, because we're grounded in it. I mean, it's you got to have a perspective out of it to comment on it, whereas by definition we can't get out of it.
Right. I think in kind of the philosophy mathematical world, Gödel's incompleteness theorems kind of gets at it, because the idea is that to completely define that system you have to be, you know, a level above, and the way I saw that deep in my coma was being in higher dimensional realms, which made it very clearly visible what the relationships were beneath that. But you know, trying to see from down here out into those higher dimensional spaces, we just can't do it. At least stuck in the human brain and mind.
I'm interested too in the fact that even after this experience, it seems that you didn't really just accept it. You had to go through a process yourself to see that it was real.
Well, I did. I mean, I mentioned a few minutes ago that, you know, I would talk with doctors and with some other people that I respected, and was just told, you were very, very sick. We can't believe you're here. We can't believe you're recovering. We can't believe you're even speaking. And only after that did I come to realize just how sick I was, and with meningitis, which is a perfect model for human death, by getting rid of that whole outer cortex, the neocortex. It's more efficient than anything else in causing coma in mimicking human death. I mean, I wouldn't be here having this discussion if I'd been in coma from really any number of other situations that can cause coma. So that was a crucial part of it. But you're right. I mean, the ultra reality, to me, it was too real to be real. I mean, that's the way I
hyper real.
Yeah, it was hyper real, which is indescribable. And some people have asked me, oh, you mean it's like HD TV? I say, no, it's like everything happening. You know, you're completely outside of time, multiple things happening at once. You see in all directions at once. You see through everything. You become all of the scene as part of witnessing it. And at times, in the core, in that deep infinity with the brilliant orb and that loving deity and this complex oversphere of higher dimensional all universe, all eternity, I would become all of it as part of the lessons of how this is constructed. And, you know, becoming all of it is a great way to get high definition.
Yes.
You know, becoming all of it is very powerful. And there was a tremendous amount of synesthesia, which was very hard for me to interpret initially as I was recalling these memories, trying to write things down. For example, on the butterfly wing in the gateway, going up through this beautiful valley with my lovely companion next to me, there were these arcs orbs of gold and silvery light that were flowing through the sky up in these big clouds and dark blue sky. They were arcing in formations, and these incredible what I would call anthems or hymns, chants, were pouring down on me. And in remembering that, often I was remembering the beauty of that music, and I would remember it as colors, colors beyond the colors of the rainbow, and these scintillating trails behind these lucent orbs, and the joy that they were emanating, this joy beyond belief. And I would have questions in my mind, not formed in words, but what, who, what's the meaning of all this? And these questions would go up, and this choir, what I later came to see is what would probably be called angels in most versions. These angelic hymns would answer in these profound, just waves like a tsunami just washing over me, and of complete understanding.
Wow.
Absolutely stunning. And the music was indescribable, but so much like a crescendo after crescendo after crescendo, just building up in these beautiful ways, very emotionally charging and energizing, and in just absolutely beautiful ways, feeling the true power of that unconditional love. And the power of that love, once I felt it, which I know many other people have felt that too, not just in NDEs, but in any transformative experiences. I know some of my patients and their families used to have what I called the gift of desperation, and that's where they felt that power and felt that love. And it comes in any number of ways, but you don't have to almost die. It can come in deep meditation, centering prayers. But that wonderful feeling of that unconditional love and the power behind that the Creator's love for the creation, and we're each divinely connected directly with that, and it's the most beautiful awareness, and yet it's something that's deep inside each and every one of us to know that.
Oh my goodness. And I know too that you eventually came to understand the identity of the young woman that you saw in your vision.
I did indeed, and it turns out that, as I said, my initial thinking on this after I got out of the hospital in the first few weeks was, wow, I was incredibly sick. How in the world do you explain that ultra reality? And then I went through the process, learning how sick I was, reading about many other cases, seeing how common this was, that this is a common territory. The afterlife is something that we all know. The memories get covered over in this life, and when we come back from an NDE, we remember some of it. But it's a reality that's more real than this one. And yet, as I read these NDE cases in your book and in other books, I knew that I had this beautiful figure, this companion on the butterfly wing, and I could remember her face perfectly. In fact, I could remember her so perfectly that I knew in my entire life before I'd never met her. And that was a big mystery. Why? Why have a deep, powerful spiritual experience like this, as powerful as any NDE I ever read, and have a stranger there? And although I think my thinking at that time was because of the meningitis, because I'd had such a complete deletion of a lot of my earthly memories, and I think this was a special case, and I think it was done for a reason. But because of that, many people encounter lost love souls that they've already lost, who have already passed over in these experiences, and they have these beautiful reunions with them. They get to communicate, say things, and know things, and trade things that they always wanted to but never had that chance. I wanted to do that with my father. My father had passed over 4 years before my coma. He'd meant the world to me, and I tried to follow in his footsteps. I knew I'd never fill those shoes, but meant a tremendous amount to me. And So my thinking, you know, 3.5 months after my coma, when I was doing all this reading and had written down my whole story, was how come he wasn't there to deliver any of this message? How come he wasn't there? And I don't remember his presence at all. And for me, that was a tremendous problem, because I knew I'd had an extremely rich and powerful spiritual experience at a time when meningitis, severe as it was in my case, should not have allowed anything to happen. I mean, that's one of the biggest gifts out of my journey, is that it says loud and clear, consciousness does not depend on the brain. In fact, consciousness is much richer when it is freed from the physical limitations, time, space, in the physical brain. And that is something that took a lot of getting used to. Having come through that world of academic neurosurgery, where that would be a heretical statement, and yet I know for certain it's absolutely true. And it's hinged in with the whole issue of the nature of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness. Quantum mechanics are a tremendous clue as to the power of that, and how our physical reality is not at all what it appears to be, and in fact depends heavily on consciousness to emerge. And that was what drove the founding fathers of quantum mechanics into mysticism, trying to explain the results of their experiments. And those experiments have only gotten more bizarre since it drove brilliant people like Einstein, Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Planck into mysticism to try and understand what it was telling them. And so I was at an impasse, because I knew something very powerful had happened. For all the world, it looked like it had to be a deep NDE, proving that rich consciousness exists without the physical brain. And yet, why was this beautiful, strange girl on the butterfly wing, time after time after time, every time I went back in, there she was? And how come my dad wasn't there? And it turns out, to get to the answer of that, which I explain very well in my book. My book goes into a lot more detail about this whole story. But a key part of the story is that I was adopted. I was put up for adoption when I was 4 months old. And I had spent some time when I was younger looking for my birth mother. Laws in North Carolina were very strict. They tried to maintain confidentiality and anonymity so that birth parents and their children would not reunite. And so those few efforts in my teens and 20s, writing to the children's home, is my birth mother out there? Is she looking for me? Answer was always no, nobody. And I had pretty much let it go, and I figured that was okay, and that was the deal made in 1954, and I should just honor it, and that was that. And then my older son, Eben, was doing a school project in 1999 that involved family heritage, and he wouldn't settle for, oh yes, well, my adoptive family, I've got these three wonderful sisters and my wonderful mother and father and all this. He wanted to know a little more than that, wanted to know the biological heritage. So I thought I'd humor him. I wrote another letter to the children's home. And then it turns out that I got an answer on that in February of 2000 when I called the social worker at the children's home. And she said, well, yes, I do have some news. And she told me that my birth parents got married. That was a tremendous shock, because everything I knew about my birth parents was that they were high school sweethearts. He was a senior, she was a sophomore, and every indication was that after they gave me up, they had to go their separate ways. And that's what I'd always assumed. So when she told me they got married, that was a tremendous shock. And she said, and they had 3 children. And your youngest sister died in 1998. And the other sister, who was the communication link with the social worker, said it was not a good time for me to come back in their lives because they were still grieving that loss. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that rejection was serious blow, and it really kind of sent me into a tailspin. And I didn't recognize the linkage, but it caused a lot of sadness in my life, and a lot of changes that kind of happened in my personal life and professional life. And it took me 7 years to go back down that pathway, because I did come to see how much it had upset me. And I later heard, of course, that often for an adult adoptee to get that second kind of rejection as an adult often sends them into a tremendous tailspin. And it certainly did in my case. But anyway, 7 years later, in August of 2007, I was on vacation with my family, and two of my three sisters, Betsy and Phyllis, were with me on a beach, Litchfield Beach in South Carolina, walking along the beach, and they said, "Don't you think it's time you reached out to your birth family again?" And I thought, oh gosh, because I remembered all the pain at that earlier rejection, but I thought they were right. Maybe I should try. And so I wrote another letter, and 2 weeks later, I got back a positive response from my birth sister saying, "Yes, we would love to meet you." And so she offered me a few details about the family, some of which were very striking, especially about my birth father, who was an aviator, naval aviator in Vietnam, flew off of aircraft carriers. And I had flown sailplanes when I was 14 years old. I soloed and loved flying always. In college, I made 365 parachute jumps. I loved skydiving. We built formations and had a tremendous time. And in fact, I had even applied for the mission specialist program to fly on the space shuttle in 1983, halfway through my neurosurgical residency, and my father talked me out of it at the time. But I found out that my birth father had also been an Apollo astronaut training in the mid-60s and worked with NASA, and then he went on to be an airline pilot for Pan Am and Delta. And after I met my birth family, which was just a wonderful experience, in October of 2007, and heard all the story about this, and we had just a wonderful reunion. Then I got to know extended family, and it was a wonderful addition to my family. My sisters I had grown up with, and my mom and dad, although my dad, as I said, had passed over 4 years before coma. But anyway, there was always that little bittersweet part that my youngest sister, Betsy, had passed over in 1998, 2 years before I even found out about my birth family. And occasionally I'd hear a little bit about her, but they didn't talk about her that much. And so it turns out that my sister Kathy had promised to send me a picture of Betsy. And I met my birth family in October of 2007. It was just over a year later than I went into coma. And I'd spent a lot more time with them, been to the summer beach cottage with them in the summer of 08 and all that kind of thing. Had gotten to know them quite well. And so then I went into coma, and it was a few months after that I did get a picture that Kathy had sent me. And I remember it was a big blow-up of Betsy. It was taken of her in Southern California, where she lived, in part of greater Los Angeles. It was taken a few months before she passed on. Beautiful picture of her, sunset behind her, and Kathy had put this poem, printed this poem over the picture. And I remember opening it and reading this poem, seeing her picture, and the poem just brought tears to my eyes. It was the most touching poem. It was called When Tomorrow Starts Without Me, by a fellow named David M. Romano, that he wrote in 1993. Beautiful poem. And I remember putting that up on my dresser, putting the picture up, and just, it was just such a touching thing to see her beautiful face. And it was the next morning I was reading more of the NDE literature, and was reading Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying. And she had numerous stories in there, but there was one about a 13-year-old girl who had had some operation and then was in a coma afterwards, had a very profound near-death experience. And she was welcomed by her brother, who showed her the wonderful unconditional love, and she was so comforted by that wonderful beauty and getting to see that heavenly welcoming place, so comforting, and to have it all with her loving brother, who helped her make a decision to come back. And then when she did, and she came back to the earthly realm, and she was recovering from her illness and everything, she finally was talking it over with her father and said, "But I don't understand. I don't have a brother." And he said, "Well, you did have a brother, but he died 3 months before you were born." And I read that line, and I remember looking up at my dresser and seeing her picture, and that's when it hit me. That my guardian angel on the butterfly wing was Betsy. And I cannot tell you how powerful that was. It was my birth sister who I'd never met. And recognizing her in that picture, all of a sudden, it all started to make sense. And that's when I realized why my father had not been there, and how I had to go several layers deeper to understand this, because I would have been much too willing to throw the whole thing out as, oh yes, when the brain is sick and dying, that's what it does, is it conjures up, the memories of those you most want to see. And this was a much deeper and very real. And of course, after that realization, I was so shocked, because all of a sudden everything made sense. It was crystal clear that that is exactly who was on the butterfly wing.
It was Betsy.
It was Betsy. And that's when I started calling my birth parents and my birth siblings and asking them questions like, well, I wanted to get to know her a little better. Well, if Betsy had been in this situation or that, what would she have done? How would she have acted? And everything they told me just told me what a beautiful, loving heart she had. She was so caring. She was always taking in stray animals. And she worked in a rape crisis center and was just a very, very loving soul. And it became obvious to me that that's exactly who it was.
Well, so you're convinced now that this life we're in is not the whole picture and there's something else.
I'm absolutely certain of it.
And so, what are your reflections on what this is all about? That given that there's an afterlife, why are we here?
Well, sometimes I call this soul school. This is, I think that our souls work together. I think that at the origin of all is consciousness, which is linked as one in the divine, all-loving, creative consciousness at the core of it all, who many people would call God. And that consciousness then is parceled out into what appear to be individuals, and yet our individual souls do have purpose and meaning in this life. And then tremendous part of my experience suggests strongly that reincarnation makes tremendous sense. But it's important to stress that that time flow is not linear and is not in kind of lockstep, flowing here on earth and in that outer realm. And in fact, in that spiritual realm, being out there, you can easily see how there's access to any part of space and time, and that our souls, they work together. This is my belief, that our souls cooperate in these journeys, kind of in and out of these lives. And in fact, that could mean I've known people in this life who, before my coma, I might have looked on as my nemesis, and found very clearly after my coma experience that sometimes those are fellow soulmates that are actually helping me learn a lesson. So it's a very obvious change to me has been an appreciation that our lives are here for us to deal with difficulties, hardships, hurdles, and that is part of our growth. And that's why this is soul school. And that, in fact, I think that our souls pick these lives, even lives that may have hardship and difficulty, because of the lessons that we're needing to learn. But all of it then serving a purpose with our souls ascending towards that highest state, getting closer and closer to that deity by manifesting that unconditional love for our fellow souls when we're here. Here, down in the down and dirty kind of molasses world of this physical reality, where the evil and injustice are part of the existence. I mean, one gift is I realize that we never learn it all, but of course learning is wonderful when you realize that you come back, and some of that comes back with us in other lives. So the more we learn, the better, and the more we work towards that ideal of the loving and serving as a conduit for that unconditional love, the more we ascend in that fundamental reality of that spiritual realm.
Yes. And Evan, I've got an intuition here that I just want to sort of work off, and it really comes from the fact that I've talked with so many other people who've had such experiences. And at the same time, I do want to go on and say, I'm an Aristotelian at heart in many ways, and Aristotle was against hyperbole, so I don't exaggerate. But I just got to say, quite frankly to you, your experience is the most fascinating I've heard in almost 50 years of listening to these things.
Well,
and in that context, a lot of people who go through these things come back in recent years, last few decades, and they say that during their time out of their body, they had a sense that all is not going well with the world. And I was wondering if there was any kind of aspect of your experience that indicated to you that the world crisis is a factor.
Yeah, there was a very strong sense, that this world is about to go through a global conscious awakening that is going to allow for the most wonderful harmony, prosperity, and peace the world has ever known. And it has to do with synthesizing spirituality, this knowing of the much higher level of our spiritual existence and our scientific selves. And that in fact that science and spirituality belong very much hand in hand. It's simply a broadening of the boundaries of science to encompass this tremendous mystery of the spirit of the human soul inside each and every one of us. That is an eternal soul. I look at it, this is being in this physical reality in this life. I look at pretty much this is one act in the play. When this act is over, my spirit joins with my higher spirit, leaves this costume behind, gets together with my fellow spirits, and then we come back in and we keep ascending. But a lot has to do with the world coming alive to this knowing of the divine nature of our spiritual selves, that each and every one of us is loved, adored by that loving Creator, and that all we need to do is to manifest that love of the Creator, knowing our eternal nature and seeing that beautiful eternal spirit inside each and every one of the others in our lives. And as I said, a lot of the hurdles in life and difficulties are there for a reason, and being able to see that loving divine connection, even with those who may not seem quite so lovable, is a big part of what enables us to get to that next level. And I think that science, by acknowledging the power of this reality of our spiritual connection with divinity, I mean, this is an old knowing. I mean, this knowing, this lesson is 3,000 years old or so, or older. And but I think our science over the last few hundred years has taken a bit of a side road by ignoring consciousness and the power of spirit and human spirit that it tells us about. To me, my experience showed very clearly spirit and soul and consciousness exist independent of the physical brain, and made it very clear that the explanation in quantum mechanics is much clearer if you see things working from that direction, from that information, as a lot of physics will say all of reality is based on, but seeing that as that divine, omnipotent, omniscient, all-loving, creative source, and then working down to this level. And it makes it much clearer how the physical reality manifests, and what quantum mechanics is telling us about the many possible realities that then become the one reality, and the linkage with consciousness. But I see the world as a very promising awakening that's coming upon us, that I think is coming fairly soon, but it does involve this transition, and it involves people can go to conferences, read books, watch the DVDs all they want. At the end of the day, you need to do the work, and that is getting down into your own consciousness, whether it's through deep meditation, centering prayer, whatever the mechanism. And the one that I use is HemiSync, which was developed by the Monroe Institute, but any number of deep meditative experience teachings can get people into this place. But it's really about taking that linguistic brain, the little voice in my head, and putting that in timeout for a little while, because this is all about getting in touch with our deeper spiritual self. And it's not about the rational voice that wants to understand everything and that's complaining because I'm not getting it, but it's about putting that voice to the side and getting self and ego out of the way, because the deepest lessons don't have to do with that self and ego. They have to do with acknowledging that those are critical parts of our makeup, but for this work they have to be put to the side, and we have to go deeper.
Yes, yes. Yeah, Evan, another thing, I first heard this story from a living human being in 1965, so that's almost 50 years ago now. And one thing I've noticed in the last few years, and I think your case is a good example of this, is that I think perhaps partly due to the advances of medicine, just in the last 10 years or so, we're seeing cases that are so far beyond what we've seen before, because we're able to bring people back from states that 20 years ago they would have just died. And so with that, I think that we're seeing a kind of deepening of these near-death experiences that we're hearing. One that's coming out soon from a man in Utah whose surgeon witnessed his near-death experience. Things are getting very difficult to explain away, I think, is what I'm getting at. And I was wondering about your reflections on, as you look ahead over the next few years, what you might think, how you see this playing out in terms of the waking up of civilization to the realization that there's something beyond this.
Well, I think that's a wonderful point, and I think that the more people recognize, and certainly the medical profession recognizes, nurses, doctors, the more they recognize that these phenomena are real, the more we allow patients and families to be free about telling these stories about what they saw. Because I can tell you this, I mean, I'm not giving you any news, but this happens every day, all over the place. Every time I give a talk to 200 people or so, I'll have several come up and say, I've never said this before, but, and then they tell me a story. This happens all the time.
Yes.
And I think a big part of this, in my view, is to help take the medical profession. Now, of course, a lot of the medical profession are already on board. I've talked with physician group, nursing groups, and most of them, especially those who work with patients who are making the transition, who are leaving the physical plane, they've seen things that are inexplicable using the conventional model. I know I had seen that several times and heard things from patients' families, and I didn't know how to explain it. And so it's extremely common. And I think by simply acknowledging this is very real, that it tells us something about our existence and about humanity and about the world in general, because this really has to do with existence of the entire universe, not just kind of existence of human beings on this planet. And it tells us something very powerful and revealing about the true nature of reality. So part of my personal mission is to try and get out to medical schools, nursing groups, to healthcare providers, hospice, nursing homes, get out there and help let people know that this is very real and that it's fine to talk about it and that we come to a better understanding, to help physicians and nurses, especially those who may not yet be on board, to try and help them to know the reality of this and how it's helpful to them and to their patients and families, to ask questions, because patients won't often volunteer these stories. So it does help to ask questions about any experience they may have had. And I think also, especially to get to medical students, I think getting to students and to the young in general can be very helpful. I personally want to go out and talk to schools, and that includes, for instance, last year I gave a talk at Bonn, my 14-year-old, to his 7th grade class, and very well received, and high schools and certainly older college kids. I think it's very important to get this out there so they understand that there is truly a deep mystery underlying consciousness, and that the very front edges of science, cosmology, physics today is wide open to this possibility. There's absolutely nothing there that closes the door on it. In fact, I would say that this understanding of human spirit and of the eternity of our souls, understanding what it says about consciousness, helps a lot in answering questions at the front edges of physics and cosmology and our understanding of existence. So for people to know that science and spirituality can easily coexist, and in fact I think by doing so will bring us to a much richer understanding of our universe than to continue with a debate as if, you know, either you're a scientist or you're religious or spiritual, but, you know, never the twain shall meet, but instead realizing that the reality as we know it today is wide open to that synthesis, to bringing those fields together, that kind of thinking together, and realizing that we are loved by this omnipotent, omniscient creator. And to understand that the power of belief and the power of possibility, of seeing things that are possible, is really what you need to move forward with this and to have an understanding. Because if you simply are a pseudo-skeptic and deny this, nope, I won't believe it until it's like a brick hitting me in the head, it'll take a much longer time for you to get it.
And a brick to your head.
Right, and it may be a brick to your head, and then you will get it. But I think that being open to these possibilities, and for people to just recognize the profound mystery of consciousness, and speaking as a neurosurgeon who then had to do a lot more work in understanding our current concepts about consciousness, I can tell you that this all makes perfect sense.
Logic came here from the other side. Parmenides worked at an oracle of the dead, and on one of his trips over there, they just, sounds like almost abducted him and said, you've got to go back and tell them this, which was the foundation of logic. He was the father of deductive reasoning, and in his insight into it came from the other side. Paradoxical to the extreme to now trying to be using it to say that it's something that, you know, demolishes the notion of an afterlife.
Yeah. And yet, I think, you know, in reality, all of this came from the other side.
It did.
Because all of us came from the other side.
This is the projection. This is the movies plus about 100 years. You know, if you think about I've seen more of it because I'm 10 years older, but I went from the newspaper and radio age to the 500 channels of full color stereo around the clock.
Yeah,
and
bombarded.
And you know, if you extend that rate of progress another 100 years, or even another 50 years, you're not going to be able to distinguish between what you see on the TV and this. So,
right.
We're already in the TV.
We're kind of living in a holodeck.
We are. This is like a holographic projection, and I guess to learn stuff from it.
Yeah, it's all about soul school. I mean, I think for me, one of the kind of the question area that I'm focusing in now has to do with free will. Has to do with predetermination, free will. You know, how much free will do we have? And is that really the purpose for all being, which I think it is. But it's a very good question because, I mean, as you know, in the neuroscientific realm, the thinking about free will was kind of knocked on its ear back in the 70s, late 70s, with Benjamin Leibotz's experiments, and basically showing that little voice in our head is a spectator and not the decision maker. Although it's so tightly tied with the ego, it's kind of waving that flag, oh, I did this, I did that, and yet that's not real. And so in the neuroscientific world, we're used to the concept decades ago that free will is not exactly what it's cracked up to be. And yet I still think that our free will and our manifesting appropriate choices in this realm based on kind of morality. I mean, as you said minutes ago, logic came from that side, and so did all the principles of morality. And you know, there's a fundamental basis for a lot of that kind of thing. And so I think for me, the whole free will question is a really big and wonderful question about trying to really fine-tune all of this, because I can tell you that my experience has told me that I have to question everything I ever assumed about time, space, mass, energy. And in fact, at this point, I think that time, as we see it, this kind of river of time, this flowing river of time, is very much an illusion of consciousness, constructed by our consciousness, that is not a fundamental part of reality. And the physics world has been closing in on that interpretation for a while.
I read David Deutsch recently talking about the notion of the flow of time. And he said it's deeply embedded in common sense, and therefore people are going to have a hard time throwing it aside, but in reality it's nonsense. Because you can understand the notion of a flow of a river because you have fixed points on the bank from which to make the assessment that it's flowing. But when you get into the notion of the flow of time, what do you use as your reference points? So it's nonsense to say that time is flowing, and yet that it really does seem to be flowing when you just think about it naively.
It does. And my interest in this has led me to two conferences that have been out in San Diego, one in 2006, one in 2011, both sponsored by the American Institute of Physics, hosted by Daniel Sheehan. And they have addressed the physical notions, the quantum notion of how we know things, and the flow of time, called the frontiers of time. But basically with papers presented that really address the kind of thorny issues of how we can impact the future, influence the future, and in fact some work that suggests that we can change the past. And it's kind of an Alice in Wonderland environment, and yet this is, you know, these are mainly physics types who are all into the hard scientific reality in every sense of the word, and yet it shows the kind of fundamental perplexity of quantum mechanics and what it tells us about consciousness and about reality and about what we assume about causality. And of course, causality is kind of upended by both relativity and quantum mechanics, and A before B or B before A is very much kind of relative depending on the conditions. And so our notions of causality are somewhat up in the air, especially when they're just locked in this kind of physical realm. And yet I think it's very telling that the physics community, the scientific world, at the very front edges is addressing this very vexing and mysterious mystery of consciousness.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is kind of
that's right, and that's
very supportive.
Yeah. I sort of went a different route from the same interests than you did. I went into the philosophy thing, and see, always I never got convinced by epiphenomenalism, because my intake into this was personal, number one. Because looking through a telescope at age 7, I realized it's like Kant said, there's two things that fascinate me and fill me with wonder: the starry heavens above me and the conscious order within me. And so I never did get into epiphenomenalism, because I always realized it was just a philosophical statement. I mean, there's no way to verify any statement about the mind-body problem. So what you tend to do is people try to handle it for themselves by latching onto something they feel comfortable with. And in the 21st century American culture, a lot of that for young people is scientific things. You know, if we can capture it in this or that, and you know, so they get seduced into this epiphenomenalism. There's no more rationality behind that than to say it the other way around, that the primary is the consciousness and everything else is just some sort of projection of that. And that always has seemed to me more instinctively correct.
What we look at is, you know, mass and kind of hard extent, the extent in space, and energy and kind of the hardness of something, the mass of something, that all of that is very much an illusion. And when you get down to the physical reality of it, it's basically, you know, vibrating strings of energy, or it just, you know, it's almost all empty space and just kind of energy manifesting information at a very core level.
Yeah, so here's my thought. And in a way, this is going to sound just so goofy to many people. I don't think it'll sound goofy to you.
Okay.
But if you read your story in a novel, you would never believe it. You see what I'm talking about? Because, I mean, what is the chance that an internationally renowned neuroscientist at Harvard, who was a convinced epiphenomenalist, would have an illness, first of all, that was such that it absolutely ruled out that he was conscious during the event, and would come back miraculously? I mean, it doesn't make any sense that you lived, to me, if I filter this through my medical knowledge.
No publisher would take this as a novel.
Oh, no, no.
It's way too far-fetched.
And so what I'm getting at here is, has it ever occurred to you that, I mean, that this is just so perfectly arranged that it seems almost by design or something? I mean, not to accuse God of being a torture person, but that somehow God put you in this position to be able to come back and bring this message?
Well, I certainly have had to entertain the thought at times that this was all meant to be for some reason. And part of that is kind of looking back over the history of it and seeing how things unfolded. For example, if I hadn't yet met my birth family, which happened a year before the coma, obviously a big element in figuring all this out would never have occurred. And I mean, there are multiple elements like that, but I've certainly, as a physician, on the one hand, I recognized exactly how sick I was, how extremely rare the disease was, and how impossible a full recovery was. And those rarities have helped to keep me focused, because I was not as likely to just think, well, this kind of thing happens now and then, next case. So in that way, I've had to really stay focused on it. So in that sense, I confess to thinking that the thought did come along that maybe this happened for some purpose. I think the important thing is, for me, I also think that kind of my humble beginnings, as a baby who was given away and not feeling much self-worth, had a lot to do with kind of that planning, because I've never really looked at myself as being an important, cog in this big wheel. I think my message is very important. I don't really look at myself as special. I say the circumstances in my case were special, but they're all about the message. I think that's an important point. And yes, people do come up to me and say, so this all-loving, infinitely knowing, infinitely powerful God gave you this illness? And
oh yeah, well, I wasn't thinking in those terms.
Well, that people ask that question,
yeah.
And of course, my answer to that, I've always thought, no, that's not the way it worked. But I do have a feeling that our souls choose these lives and choose these missions. And although I certainly was not aware of it before, potentially that could explain it. But I think you're right. The rarity of the disease and of the recovery,
plus the circumstances of your education,
and the circumstance of my education,
and
because
the birth.
If one of my patients had told me this story before my coma, I would have said, yes, you were very sick. I would have patted him on the shoulder just like my doctor is. Yeah, you were very sick. We didn't think you were going to live through this. I can't believe you're even saying anything. But that doesn't answer it, because there's no way to explain the experience I had, very rich, detailed experience, that I started writing up right at the moment I got home, when I was still very fragile and didn't remember anything.
Your book, in a way, reminds me of the writings of Spinoza because of their rigor. You start with this, and you go very carefully through in your book, carefully excluding every other possibility than that you went into some other dimension of reality. So I think that's a very powerful. I'm a logician, and I'm astonished by your book. It's really so well, completely reasoned out, and
well,
I would say you can't even just get there's no crack in it where you could get any sort of objection in, unless you've got some tear, to be honest. I'm sure there will be people, but I think they're going to look pretty ridiculous.
Well, I think I originally overwrote the book tremendously. I've written about 5 times the current length of it, because I had to understand this myself. And as I said earlier, initially I was totally blown away by the ultra reality of this incredibly rich experience, just as millions of people are when they have a near-death experience and come back. And as millions, as my physicians told me, oh, you were very sick, and oh yes, the sick brain can do anything, I was kind of, yes, I understand. Oh, okay, I see. Hyperreality, it was too real to be real. So then I was looking for the scientific explanation. And I went through several models, as I mentioned earlier, and it, to me, I think that's the real strength of it, is this was to be a report to neuroscientists about what it's like in coma, and an attempt at an explanation for that extreme sense of hyperreality and very rich experience deep inside of, a profound coma, near-death experience, and to try and explain some of that. But then exhaustive review of all the facts, and again, the gift of severe bacterial meningitis, because without that, I could not have come to these conclusions. But it helped me very clearly to see that this rich experience described by so many people with NDEs and other spiritually transformative experiences of all manner, not necessarily involving a sick brain or a sick body, are based in a reality that's very powerful, that we need to understand if we want to understand our existence in this universe.
Yeah, it's funny, I never even thought for a moment about this implying that God was a sadist, that he put you through this, because you think about it, he knows what's going to happen.
No.
So it's just, this was for you and for the rest of us, I think.
Well, I think so, and again, I've tried to take the focus off of me and really somewhat off of the story. I mean, the fact is, those 20,000 words of the deep coma experience are very real.
Yeah.
And that's where my discussion and my debate about possible mechanisms lies. And I'm happy to talk those over with anyone. The issue is, with a very severe meningitis, there's basically no place for a rich experience to happen like
That's
this.
exactly
the brain,
right.
It cannot happen in the brain. It cannot happen in physical reality.
Yeah.
It is very real. It's not simply something of mind, because this happened when mind was not working either in that sense, although spirit, soul, outside of physical reality was very much flourishing.
By everything I learned in medical school and neuroscience and my psychiatry residency and all of the knowledge about psychiatry that I've obtained in the intervening years, I would just, taking that knowledge and applying it to your case, the reality is that you couldn't have been conscious.
Right.
If the neurophysiological theory is correct.
There was no place in my brain, before, during, or after my coma to put this together.
That's right.
And that's the part that's so stunning. And as I said, if that's all I had in the world, if I came back and nobody else had ever had a near-death experience, and there wasn't overwhelming evidence for extended non-local consciousness, as in Irreducible Mind and in Pim Van Lommel's wonderful book on consciousness beyond life, if none of that existed, I'd probably just have to say odd things happen. But the fact is, all that is out there. It's all very real. It's time that people who want to know truth, and scientists, philosophers, acknowledge, okay, so consciousness is a much deeper phenomenon than we ever thought before in our materialistic, physicalist worldview. And of course, that's why very smart people, Einstein, Bohr, Schrödinger, the inventors of quantum mechanics, that's why they turned to mysticism, because they were very smart. Their experiments told them there's something much deeper to consciousness. And all we're doing now is saying, yeah, they were right. Those very smart people were right. So let's get to work trying to understand our existence.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to do. It's a much deeper, richer existence. And the good news is that our physical life in these bodies is, when this ends, that's not the end.
Yeah.
And that's something I know through and through. I'll never doubt that, because to me it's crystal clear.
Yeah.
And I think the logic should support that for many people.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I got into this through such a different route. It was through ancient Greek philosophy and meeting George Ritchie and Plato and so on. And I just, really, it's hard for me to kick off the impression that we're sort of here to bring this out. I really do think. And I mean, that sounds paranoid almost, but I think we're kind of here on a mission. I think we signed up for this before we even were born.
That's very possible. I mean, to me, it's comforting to realize that, in fact, this is not news. You know, that this message really is ancient, millennia old. And I think we've been sidetracked for a few centuries by kind of a seduction into science and technology. And science and technology are wonderful, and yet it's not all just in this physical realm, and we need to understand that in a much richer sense. And so in that manner, I think that all we're doing is kind of helping to bring the world back on track.
Yes, exactly. It doesn't mean we're heroes. That is exactly right.
A little sidetrack there.
When science came along, then people said, well, let's focus on the things that we can figure out by this method.
Right.
And then after a few hundred years of that in the universities, then there was a subtle shift to saying, well, nothing that doesn't fit this method is real.
Right.
And that was a major mistake.
And that's completely wrong. Absolutely wrong. And that's where the consciousness comes in, and our the current view in neuroscience and philosophy of mind that we really don't have the slightest clue how consciousness emerges out of physical reality.
Just always been completely content with that.
Yeah. It is quite a mission, to say the least, but I'm very optimistic about what it brings to this world.
Well, that's good, because I'm not so much. I just see I'm seeing a different trail of events, and I mean, I know from friends in the intelligence community and seeing what's going on, and I worry that there's going to be a big collapse. So therefore, when I hear you saying you don't think so, then I think this is great, because I want to be wrong on this one. I really do.
I think a lot of it has to do with, you know, to this point, a lot of people would say we've had kind of an ongoing battle. You know, science, you're either scientific and have a scientific modern mind, or you're religious or spiritual and have a less modern mind. And I think what I see as part of my optimism is seeing that any kind of addiction to dogmatic preaching and acceptance of dogmatic thought from either science or religion will be something that people will question and kind of realize that we can move beyond that and see a much broader view of the possibilities for humanity that do not involve getting into kind of a dysfunctional entrenchment around outmoded concepts, but a much broader awareness of the possibilities for human spirit and for manifesting our greatest side, which includes, you know, the science and technology properly applied, but with that beautiful, loving harmony around the world.
Well, I want to talk a minute about your book, Proof of Heaven. Simon and Schuster is the best book on this subject of near-death experiences. And I think this is going to change the world, Edmund. I'm absolutely sure of it. So you're on a really interesting trip here.
Well, I appreciate that. I would have said that I think you have some books that are the best, but I appreciate your compliment nonetheless. And I think it's important for people to understand that this is not about me. It's not about some, you know, coming out here and saying, "Oh, I'm something special," because, you know, in essence, I think I'm still that child who was given away, and that was a big part of shaping me up for this role. But a lot has to do with the fact that I did have enough experience and plenty of experience being a scientific skeptic and a physical physicalist, reductive materialist, believing in, physics, chemistry, biology. We build everything we know that's real out of that, and that's all we need. And I now know that that is not true. And in fact, the seeds for that knowing were planted with quantum mechanics and the enigma of that long ago. And I think the important thing for people to understand is that having meningitis and going through what I went through, where I had a complete erasure of all of my life and knowledge, all my language, everything, and yet I had this incredibly rich experience that is rich beyond description, and that even in trying to put it into words, when I finally wrote it down, was 20,000 words in 6 weeks after my recovery. That was not some little blip of noise that happened in a chaotic brain that was sick. And I go through 9 hypotheses in my book about possible neuroscientific explanations for that ultra reality deep in the middle of coma due to meningitis. And truth be told, when you get right down to it, none of them work. And in my view, and I've talked this over with a lot of other neuroscientists, philosophers of mind, and people agree. I mean, this is not me shooting from the hip. I went through a long period of analysis of the experience trying to explain it neuroscientifically. Yes. And then after 4 months realized it did not happen in my brain. It's very real. It's a much more real existence than this world around us here, the physical world. And it's happened to millions of people. This is not just something about me. And it's happened over thousands of years. And it's happened in cultures all around the world, in believers, non-believers, all religions, and the experiences are very, very similar. In fact, the similarities far outweigh the differences. The differences I see as being kind of an overlay from our cultural background, from our basically from our brain.
From our
linguistic side. And once you realize that consciousness is primary and the brain is not making consciousness, then it becomes much clearer how the brain actually is working as a filter, reducing valve, to kind of put it down to a trickle so that we can survive on Earth in this kind of dumbed down view of our physical reality. And yet it makes more sense to see it that way than to say that consciousness emerges from the brain. Because my experience very clearly showed no, it doesn't. My experience very clearly showed consciousness is much richer outside of the brain, free to those limitations, which says very loudly that when the body and the brain die, consciousness is liberated to a much greater existence. And it's not something that dies when the brain dies. And then that richness of that environment, as I said, I'm not the first one to go there. I was shocked at all the similarities and consistencies across all these millennia and continents. And to me, that is a very, very powerful statement. The fact that a Christian might go in and see the bright light as Jesus, and a Muslim might go in and see the bright light as Muhammad, to me is no different, because that's the filtering mechanism of the brain. That's the overlay as we come back in. But it has nothing to do with the underlying reality about the incredible love there, that we are spirits with a purpose and with meaning in our existence that far, far outlives the kind of existence that I used to think was our lot in the material realm, where you were given your 70 years plus or minus, and that was it. And that's not the way it is. This gives me a much richer understanding of the true nature of the existence that we all share. And I think that will be a wonderful gift for the world to start to understand this and to see the power of this infinitely loving and unconditionally loving spirit of this deity that is within each and every one of us and is part of this entire universe, because we're all connected in that way. And I think the more people know this, the more they can feel connected, as we all are. And many of the world's ills will become less and less over time as more and more people are welcomed into this fold and know this community and this oneness that we all really are. So by sharing these experiences, by building up this collection of experiences, by serving as an educational forum, I think we can help everybody feel that connection in a way that'll help make this world a better place.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I'm just honored and delighted to have spent this time with you.